My business rival tried to destroy my company, so I bought his and fired him on his birthday. 6 months ago, I was running a moderately successful tech startup from my garage, thinking I had the world figured out. The company specialized in custom software solutions for small businesses, and while we weren't making millions, we were growing steadily and had a solid client base of about 40 companies across 3 states. I had 3 employees working with me, and we operated like a tight-knit family where everyone knew everyone's coffee order and weekend plans. Everything changed when my former college roommate decided to launch his own competing business, just 2 blocks away from my office. We hadn't spoken in years, not since that messy falling out over a girl in our senior year, but apparently he'd been watching my success from afar and decided he wanted a piece of the action. What started as friendly competition quickly turned into something much more sinister and personal. The first sign something was wrong came when 2 of my biggest clients suddenly canceled their contracts within the same week. These were companies I'd worked with for over 2 years, relationships I'd built from scratch through late-night troubleshooting sessions and weekend emergency fixes. When I called to ask what happened, they gave me vague explanations about budget cuts and changing priorities, but something in their voices told me there was more to the story. A week later, one of my employees mentioned seeing my rival at a local business networking event, schmoozing with potential clients, and apparently badmouthing my company's reliability. He was telling people we were on the verge of bankruptcy and couldn't deliver projects on time, which was completely false. Our track record was spotless, and we'd never missed a deadline in 3 years of operation. The real kicker came when I discovered he'd been offering services at prices so low they were practically giving work away for free. He was undercutting my quotes by 60%, which made no business sense unless his goal was to destroy my company rather than build his own. No legitimate business could sustain those prices and still pay employees or cover basic operating costs. Within a month, I'd lost 6 more clients, and my remaining employees were starting to worry about job security. The stress was eating me alive, and I found myself staying awake until 3 in the morning, refreshing my email and checking bank balances obsessively. My girlfriend started complaining that I was becoming distant and irritable, always talking about work problems instead of enjoying our time together. Then came the most devastating blow of all. My rival somehow managed to poach my head developer, the guy who'd been with me since day one and knew all our proprietary code and client relationships. He offered him double his current salary plus equity in his company, which I simply couldn't match with my current financial situation. Losing him felt like losing a brother, and it left me scrambling to handle projects that required his specific expertise. But here's where things get interesting and where my rival made his first major mistake. In his eagerness to destroy my business, he'd been operating at massive losses for months, burning through his initial investment capital at an unsustainable rate. He'd also been bragging about his success to mutual friends, claiming he was about to become the dominant player in our local market. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting everything. Every instance of client poaching, every lie he'd told about my company's financial stability, every anti-competitive practice he'd engaged in. I'd also been having coffee with some of his former employees who'd left his company, and they painted a picture of a workplace that was chaos incarnate, with unrealistic deadlines and promises being made to clients that couldn't possibly be kept. The breakthrough came when I learned that his main investor was getting cold feet about the hemorrhaging money situation. This investor was a local successful entrepreneur who valued integrity and long-term thinking over quick profits. Through a mutual contact, I arranged a casual meeting with him at a downtown coffee shop, ostensibly to discuss market conditions and potential collaboration opportunities. During our conversation, I didn't badmouth my rival directly, but I did share some concerns about the sustainability of the current pricing war in our industry. I mentioned how impossible it would be for any company to maintain quality service while operating at such aggressive price points, and how clients were ultimately hurt when companies overpromised and underdelivered due to financial constraints. The investor was clearly thinking the same thing, and he started asking pointed questions about my own business model and financial stability. I was completely transparent about my challenges, but also showed him our solid client retention history, positive cash flow trends, and conservative growth projections. The contrast with his current investment was stark and obvious. 2 weeks later, I got a call that changed everything. The investor wanted to meet again, this time with a proposal. He was planning to withdraw his funding from my rival's company, and he wanted to invest in mine instead. But there was a twist that made this offer even more appealing than it initially seemed. He discovered that my rival had been lying about his company's performance metrics and client satisfaction rates. The investor had commissioned an independent audit that revealed systematic overbilling, missed deadlines, and several clients who were already planning to terminate their contracts due to poor service quality. My rival's house of cards was collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. The investor's proposal was elegant in its simplicity. He would provide enough capital for me to acquire my rival's company assets, client contracts, and remaining employees. This would eliminate my competition while expanding my business significantly, and it would happen at a fraction of what either company would be worth under normal circumstances. But the most satisfying part was yet to come. The acquisition would be structured as a merger, with me as the surviving entity and my rival's company being dissolved. This meant I would technically become his boss for the brief period between the acquisition closing and the redundant positions being eliminated. I spent the next month working with lawyers and accountants to structure the deal properly. The due diligence process revealed even more problems with my rival's operations than I'd initially suspected. He'd been cutting corners on quality control, using unlicensed software, and making promises to clients that his team couldn't possibly fulfill given their current resources and capabilities. The final negotiations were surreal. My rival was so desperate to avoid complete bankruptcy that he agreed to terms that were incredibly favorable to me. He even had to personally guarantee some of the company's debts, which meant he'd be financially responsible if certain client contracts couldn't be fulfilled during the transition period. Throughout this entire process, I kept thinking about the timing. The deal was scheduled to close on a Tuesday in late October, which I initially thought was just another random business day. But when I checked the calendar more carefully, I realized it was actually my rival's birthday. The universe seemed to have a sense of humor about the whole situation. The morning of the closing, I arrived at the lawyer's office feeling a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. My rival looked exhausted and defeated, clearly understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered but having no choice but to go through with the deal. He'd lost weight, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he kept checking his phone anxiously as if expecting some last-minute miracle. After 3 hours of paperwork and final signatures, the deal was officially complete. I now owned his company, his client contracts, his office lease, and technically had authority over his employment status. The lawyer explained that while the company was being dissolved, there would be a brief transition period where existing employees would remain on payroll until their roles could be evaluated and restructured. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I asked to speak with my rival privately in the conference room, and once the door was closed, I delivered the news with as much professionalism as I could muster. Due to redundancy and the need to streamline operations, his position was being eliminated effective immediately. He would receive the minimum severance required by law, but his employment was terminated as of that moment. His face went through a series of emotions that I'll never forget. First confusion, then realization, then a mixture of anger and defeat that seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. He started to say something, probably some angry retort about the situation, but then seemed to remember that he was legally bound by the agreements he'd just signed. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who'd spent months trying to destroy my livelihood, who'd used every dirty trick in the book to undercut my business and steal my clients, was now unemployed and facing significant personal financial liability. And it was happening on his birthday, which somehow made the whole thing feel like cosmic justice. But the story doesn't end there because the real surprise was still coming. After my rival left the lawyer's office, probably to spend his birthday figuring out how to rebuild his career and pay his debts, I started reviewing the client contracts I'd just acquired. Most of them were exactly what I'd expected, but there was one contract that made me do a double take. Buried in the pile of paperwork was a service agreement with a major corporation that I'd been trying to land as a client for over a year. This company represented the kind of breakthrough account that could single-handedly double my revenue, and I'd submitted proposals to them multiple times without success. Apparently, my rival had somehow managed to win their business, probably through the same unsustainable pricing strategy he'd used everywhere else. But here's the kicker. The contract was structured in a way that heavily favored the client, with penalty clauses and service-level agreements that my rival's team couldn't possibly meet. He'd essentially signed up to lose money on every hour of work performed, while also being legally obligated to deliver results that his understaffed and inexperienced team couldn't achieve. However, my team and I could absolutely deliver on those commitments. And even with the unfavorable pricing, the contract would still be profitable for us, because we had the expertise and infrastructure to work efficiently. What had been a financial disaster for my rival was actually a golden opportunity for my company. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of integrating the acquired assets and transitioning clients to our service standards. Several of my rival's former clients were thrilled to learn that their accounts were being transferred to my company, since they'd been experiencing significant service problems and were considering canceling their contracts entirely. I also hired back my former head developer, who'd been miserable working for my rival and was eager to return to a more professional and stable environment. He brought with him valuable insights about my rival's operational failures and client management problems, which helped me avoid similar mistakes during the integration process. The most satisfying moment came about a month later, when I ran into my rival at a local restaurant. He was there with what appeared to be a job interview, probably trying to find employment after his spectacular business failure. He saw me across the room and gave me a look that was equal parts resentment and grudging respect. I didn't approach him or say anything, but I did raise my glass slightly in his direction, a subtle acknowledgement of how the whole situation had played out. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to convey his understanding that he'd been outplayed and that any animosity at this point would be pointless. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that my rival's attempt to destroy my company actually made me a better entrepreneur. The pressure forced me to be more strategic, more resourceful, and more focused on building sustainable competitive advantages rather than just coasting on past success. My company is now 3 times larger than it was before this whole ordeal began, with a more diverse client base and stronger financial foundation. The experience taught me valuable lessons about competitor analysis, market positioning, and the importance of maintaining ethical business practices even when others choose to fight dirty. The irony is that my rival probably could have built a successful competing business if he'd focused on differentiation and value creation instead of trying to destroy me. The market was certainly large enough for multiple players, and his technical skills were genuinely impressive when applied constructively rather than destructively. But his personal vendetta blinded him to better strategies, and his willingness to sacrifice long-term sustainability for short-term competitive advantage ultimately led to his downfall. In trying to destroy my company, he destroyed his own, and handed me the resources to become stronger than I ever could have been on my own. The whole experience reinforced my belief that success in business, like in life, comes from focusing on your own performance rather than trying to sabotage others. Competition can be healthy and productive, but when it becomes personal and destructive, it usually ends badly for everyone involved. Today, my company continues to grow and thrive, and I've learned to appreciate the challenges that push me to become better rather than resenting the people who create those challenges. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, and in this case, it was also buying out your rival and firing him on his birthday.